Growing up as a 2000s kid, first-person shooters were the lifeblood of my Saturdays, Sundays, and 1 a.m. ending weekdays. I basically existed back then entirely in anticipation of eventually reuniting with my Xbox 360 and Modern Warfare 3, mayhaps paired with some Super Mario Galaxy if I was feeling feisty. And let me run a quick test. 2000s, 2010s, Call of Duty, Battlefield, Halo, Wolfenstein. I'm guessing that the mere mention of that string of words may have brought a tear to some of your eyes, and I'm all with you. These games were the shit back then. While not every big-budget FPS game was universally loved, it felt like back in the late 2000s and 2010s, there were just so many different big grand IPs to choose from at any time, with multiple gems inside each one. Every year, we looked forward to whatever new invention or successor would be released, whether that be within a beloved IP or in the form of a brand new invention, with a greater than not chance that at the very least, the games would provide fun, creative, sometimes slurred-filled, new FPS experiences. And more specifically, there was always an expounded source of AAA, creative, well-constructed, single-player FPS games. Multiplayer PvP shooters with a campaign, co-op FPS shooters with single-player options, entirely single-player dedicated games, whatever form it may take, single-player FPS gamers ate good back in the day. Even in a market that saw large success in multiplayer PvP competitive shooters, it seemed like studios in this space still took the time to either include a single-player option to their titles or invent titles that were entirely single-player. For instance, it was basically just understood that big names like Call of Duty, Battlefield, Halo, and the such always had a great campaign. It was as expected as their respective great online multiplayer. And lots of other larger studios also pursued development of solely single-player FPS games, and good ones at that. Titanfall, Borderlands, Far Cry, Wolfenstein, Bioshock, Fallout, Prey. There were tons of these games, and even with the high quantity, the quality of the games were also pristine. None were perfect, of course, but most all of them were built around an incredibly creative world and narrative, had innovative gun gameplay that tied into the atmosphere and setting of the titles, and overall just showed the immense passion of the developers behind the screen to, as a top priority, make an enjoyable experience for the player, not tick off a checklist box to get the game X amount of revenue. In hindsight, I really took for granted the abundance of good single-player options I had back in the day, considering that was just the standard, which is in a very stark contrast to the modern AAA FPS scene. Yeah, it's no surprise to anyone that the single-player FPS scene has definitely changed. AAA multiplayer IPs seem to have entirely abandoned ship on single-player options, existing single-player IPs' successive iterations have been declining, new larger studio innovative single-player FPSs are becoming less and less common, there's generally just been a single-player market hole, both in quantity and quality. Now, I'm not saying that single-player FPS as a whole is a barren wasteland, but relatively speaking overall, there just isn't that much in the way of good quality single-player FPS, which I'm now calling SFPS, when it comes to AAA studio content. It's very evident that the overall market of FPS has been dominated instead by live service PvP. Battle Royale, competitive PvP, multiplayer extraction, these types of genres seem to really be all that big budget companies are focusing on, and even those have been iffy on the quality. But hey, at least they have some quantity. SFPS honestly has been struggling with both. Go online and Google best SFPS games right now, and I bet you my right fro that few of the games in the list are AAA and made in the last 5 years. There's been some good ones that have come out recently like High on Life, but these few and far between titles are, well, few and far between, in stark juxtaposition to the quantity we expected just a decade or so ago. And considering out of the some that have released recently, it's more and more rare that the quality hits the standard we would expect, I think us consumers are much overdue for getting more. And while this has been an entirely negative rant, luckily in the modern age, we have a glistening light of hope at the end of the tunnel, an oasis of our coveted SFPS titles shining in the glistening pool of indie games. Indie has been a force present in the broader FPS scene for decades. A lot of popular games you probably know of were surprisingly made by pretty small and at the time unknown teams, and many indie games have made their stance alongside the big budget titles over the years. However, recently, with the growing accessibility of making games due to technological advancements, indie games have really started to pick up in the FPS, and specifically SFPS scene. And geez, do we need them now more than ever. AAA, as I mentioned before, has disappointingly been taking in both the quality and quantity of their SFPS titles. I'm honestly convinced the sphere as a whole would be dead without indie, and I could delve into a whole multi-hour video going over the broader strokes of indie in the FPS field, but this isn't a broader strokes of indie channel. No, I want to delve more specifically into how a certain genre is mastering SFPS, in ways that annoyingly AAA studios just can't seem to grasp. This is how Roguelike FPS succeeds where modern AAA FPS fails. FPS but more chaotic. FPS but more random. FPS but music. Roguelike and FPS are in a weird way like peanut butter and honey. Both are great, but the idea of the combination of the two seems kinda odd and sticky at first. But then when you taste it, mwah, magnifique. I have very thoroughly enjoyed the sticky glob of roguelike FPSs I've played so far, and I think if the genre continues to grow as it has a chance to shoot some life-saving globby goodness into the greater FPS genre, filling the gap that big studios have left wide open. Let me attempt to explain that. If any field has been recently developing some great FPS titles, it's the roguelike. Bullets Per Minute, Gunfire Reborn, RoboQuest, Void Bastards, Crux, Post Void. While not the largest in numbers, the genre has recently been putting out some titles, which is more than I can say for some certain developers. And some good ones at that. These games have honestly been some of the most unique fun I've had in my entire experience in the FPS genre, in large part because of what they offer that is missing in larger budget games nowadays, with one such docket being a good quantity of SFPS titles. As I mentioned before, SFPS games specifically have really been a sore spot of modern AAA developers, especially in terms of quantity. It is harder than ever to find a good AAA SFPS game from larger studios, and yes, there's a lot more good indie options, I'm just focusing specifically on roguelikes and AAA here. Compared to the past, it just feels like the market for SFPS has moved on for AAA, perhaps due to its more limited monetization capabilities or the uncertainty of its profit margin in comparison to the now tried and true live service PvP model. Following a debatably harmful trend nowadays with media, making a game for a big budget studio has become a really big deal, with budgets and scales only getting larger and larger, meaning the importance of the success of every individual game monetarily is at an all-time high. And as such, it feels like studios are really taking the safe route with their games, i.e. having live service PvP or the likes that can be flooded with microtransactions or charge ludicrous amounts of money for the game itself with additional subscriptions, to ensure that even the most mediocre of titles can provide a large return. Honestly, in my opinion, it's like they're shooting themselves in the foot while having medical supplies on hand. Like the games are expected to probably not rake in what they want on their own merit, so they gotta have subsidies in the form of microtransactions and subscriptions and all that to support the bottom line. Doom talk aside, this is where the roguelike steps in. By contrast, there's a lot of roguelike SFPS options out there, as most every roguelike FPS is inherently an SFPS, and there's a lot of roguelike FPSs being produced. Considering their indie nature and general smaller scale, roguelikes aren't plagued as heavily by multi-year-long production that is heavily funneled by throsts of execs to follow a certain archetype. They instead have a lot more freedom to just make games. I know this sounds like a silly point, but I really think roguelike FPS have a massive advantage on modern AAA FPS for this reason, filling the market gap that many consumers still actively want to see games in, but AAA refuse to produce in. And on top of being assisted by their indie nature, the larger quantity of roguelike FPS is also heavily assisted by the perk of being a roguelike. What I mean by that is, the roguelike archetype and its traits provide a near-endless and incredibly fun basis for a game without requiring near-endless development. To best illustrate my point, let's clash the roguelike FPS in comparison to a linear story SFPS. To create the linear game, you as a developer would have to develop each and every part of the story for the player to play, crafting every unique level and story beat and area just for the player to clear through it and move on to the next piece that you'd have to create as well. And yes, while there's often opportunity to return back to finished areas, the events that took place there are now over, so to give meaning to returning, you would have to add in even more to that section to return to, further increasing development time. Considering it takes eons longer to create and code and develop sections of games as opposed to playing them, the number of hours put into making our hypothetical linear game is a fraction of the time that a player will spend on it. Compound that with the grand scope of AAA, and you get the incredibly long development times and coupled essentiality of success plaguing modern AAA that I mentioned earlier. Long development time nor linear story SFPS games are not inherently a bad thing, by the way. There are a lot of incredible linear games out there that very well display the high effort and time put into them. I'm just using them as an example to better explain the contrast of the roguelike. One of the main and most unique principles of any roguelike is looping. By that, I mean most every roguelike out there will have its players die over and over again, and replay the game after every death, effectively replaying the exact same game multiple times with procedural generation, i.e. randomizing the layouts, enemies, items, etc. in each run, mixing up every run to make the runs different from each other. This means that in comparison to having to create every event and story beat for the players to progress through as you would in a linear game, roguelike developers instead just need to create one large path for the players to go through to reach the end goal, populate the path, and then let procedural generation and looping take over from there. It turns from having to make every event for the player to see once to making one event for the player to see hundreds of times, leading to every event reaping exponentially more hours of playtime compared to linear progression. decreasing the amount of events needed to supply an adequate amount of gameplay to the player, relatively speaking. Now, this isn't to say that making a good roguelike FPS or roguelike in general is easy, but I think looping and procedural generation do give an edge in terms of how long it takes to develop quality roguelikes, as these traits massively extend the playability of a roguelike without requiring massive additional inputs nor compromising the quality of the gameplay. Take Gunfire Reborn as an example. It's a roguelike FPS that follows your character fighting your way through an unknown realm, utilizing guns and magic to defeat the enemies and bosses in your path as you progress through multiple different dungeons and many different environments. On the surface, it's pretty simplistic. There's a unique magic aspect of the game integrated with standard FPS gameplay, several varied areas with unique themes in them, and some fun bosses, all encompassing a playtime of maybe an hour, hour and a half. Certainly nothing that feels like it'd take a deep dive to get through. And yet, the simple fact that the game, along with being fun in its own right, utilizes roguelike aspects in its gameplay formula has made it an incredibly fun experience that I've spent multiple hours on. The game on its own merit is very solid. It's got great controls, good graphics, a good variety of weapons and abilities, smooth gunplay, good enemy variants, all that. But it also very well integrates the aspects of procedural generation and looping into its gameplay to further supplement the game. Goblets and occult scrolls can be picked up along a run, which have a host of unique effects, from adding to your stats to enhancing your weapons to boosting your character abilities. Tons of different weapons are scattered throughout runs to collect, each with their own unique attributes and modifiers in the form of inscriptions, which are randomized. Elements are infused into every aspect of your run, affecting your items, guns, and the enemies you face, further increasing the variability in procedural generation. And there are a full host of characters with unique attributes and abilities to change up gameplay, along with a skill tree to further unlock more stat upgrades and passive abilities for your runs. The combination of all these elements mixed with procedural generation applied to everything in every run, along with having permanent upgrades to save up for, makes this game capable of hundreds of hours of gameplay, with the gameplay almost always feeling new and fulfilling on every run. I don't know much about the development of this game, but I do know that the team behind it has a fraction of the manpower and budget compared to other much larger studios, and yet they've made a game that I can spend even more time enjoying compared to some FPS games by larger studios. Combining the obvious passion of the developers with the ability to really hone in on making their small game a unique and fun experience, while being able to rely on the looping aspect of roguelikes to supplement additional gameplay, I think in large part makes this game the banger that it is, and is a consistent trait that can be seen across the roguelike FPS genre. This all culminates to my main point that roguelike FPSs are developing SFPS titles in strides that AAA can't, and honestly don't want, to compete with, providing an ample supply to the SFPS games that I loved playing so much in the past. But just quantity is not the only thing that roguelikes are doing that modern AAA can't, because what is quantity without quality? A big grievance I have with modern AAA FPS titles nowadays is with their quality. Now this goes into a wide berth of different aspects, but what I more specifically mean is the quality of their creativity. In the case of modern AAA FPS, the story and gameplay usually follow the same linear, military, mission-centric gun gameplay that adds some weapons and maybe a new story on top of whatever game came before it, with the added 2 gimmicks of whatever the new game has. Hot take, but it feels like there isn't really much true innovation anymore in the AAA scene. No addition of exciting game modes like zombies to COD, or brand new inventive and lore-rich worlds to explore such as that in Wolfenstein, or radically unique gameplay and mechanics infused into FPS like that of Titanfall 2. And I think this really boils down to a lessened emphasis on unrestricted creativity. Expanding out an idea that hasn't been proven to work but has a promising look, creating or developing a story and world that don't take the beaten path, making gameplay, mechanics, and graphics that might not satisfy investors in the bottom line like previous titles or other successful games, but have the potential to be something breathtaking. These results don't feel like they are pursued anymore, and as a result, the overall uniqueness and creativity of a lot of modern AAA has felt lackluster. Interstage writes, a roguelike FPS.
Nice!
Roguelike, considering their predominantly indie nature, not being dependent on needing to please pockets or hit certain target sales, and being devoid of executive influence, means they are able to freely pursue more creative ideas and unique gameplay, settings, and mechanics. And generally, they have more of a drive to do so. If you can't stand out in your amazing lifelike graphics or massive worlds, then pursuing uniqueness in your gameplay and style are much more palpable and, in my opinion, much more interesting options. And roguelike FPS have the unique added bonus of an entire other genre to infuse into the standard FPS gameplay on top of whatever game-specific gimmicks, setting, and world the individual games have to offer. It's like a freely customizable honey peanut butter sandwich with some nice extra modifiable but guaranteed jam thrown in the mix. The roguelike, as I said before, relies heavily on the principles of looping and procedural generation, and the unique way that these components are mixed with the FPS platform, along with the individual game's own distinctive twists and creative indie freedoms, make for some incredibly fun and creative games. Take bullets per minute, for example. On the surface, it's an SFPS following your travel through a demonic realm to defeat a dragon with guns. But also, you get procedural generated areas, items for the run, gear, and guns along the way. And also, dying resets the game anew with brand new procedural generated maps to explore. And also, it's a rhythm-based shooter. And also, it has its own full world of unique characters, abilities, enemies, and bosses in multiple environments and settings. And it fucking slaps. The combination of all these devices makes BPM a masterclass gaming onion. Multiple layers of fun and unique gameplay morphed together into one gaming experience. Its own unique identity as a game, the fun of an SFPS, and the fun of a roguelike. And I love it. It's such a uniquely fun game with its combination of a well-developed genre, a niche genre, and its own spin, giving it its own awesome and unique identity that I haven't seen in many other titles, making for hours upon hours of gameplay for myself and others to enjoy. For sake of time, I'm not going to delve too much deeper into the game here, but definitely check it out if you have time. It's an awesome little game that can easily get you over 100 hours of solid gameplay. The point I make with all this is that while many modern AAA FPS games have quality in their graphics, their size, their scope, they can often miss the mark on creating a quality world, uniquely fun gameplay experience, and creative innovation to tack onto their base in FPS. Roguelike FPS, on the other hand, have both the freedom to explore more creative ideas that come from being in the indie sphere, and additionally have the whole roguelike genre to incorporate into their games to even further add variables to push unique gameplay, mechanics, and world building. Looking across the variety of roguelike FPS games I played recently, they all are aligned in their FPS status, yet they have such contrasting settings, mechanics, and gameplay, each providing an interesting take on the FPS genre with their own unique identity infused with the unique integration of roguelike mechanics, creating the incredibly long gameplay sessions I can have with each of them without getting bored, and enabling me to switch between them and experience something entirely new from title to title. Modern AAA FPS aren't all absolute garbage, and I have to give credit to the ones that have recently released to massive success, emulating the kind of quality I would expect from such titles a decade or two ago. However, as time has gone on, I can both see and feel a sad decline overall in the AAA FPS scene, both in terms of diminished quality due to creative restriction and a lack of innovation, and diminished quantity from a shift in the market coupled with monetary gain set as a priority, and the long development times that come with AAA. Having roguelike FPS to fall back onto has been such a saving grace, supplying me with ample options of games to pick from that all have that quality uniqueness I've so longed to see. Honestly, to be fair, that is just the case for indie FPS in general, and there are also a lot of awesome indie FPS games to fall back onto, but being a big ol' sucker for the genre, roguelike FPSs to me take another step forward in their quantity of SFPS titles specifically, and their unique integration of another full genre into their own unique gameplay and worlds, further boosting their quality. This isn't to say they are better than other indie FPS titles, only that I, as a massive fan of the roguelike genre, appreciate both the quality and quantity they are able to supply in SFPS, coupled alongside the wide berth of other indie FPS titles to enjoy as well. And that's really all I've got to state about the matter. This video definitely felt a bit different in that it's more of just a kind of ranty one of this random idea I had about AAA and roguelike FPS while playing BPM, but hopefully y'all enjoyed my bantering regardless. And what do you all think about the state of FPS? Are roguelike FPSs actually all that I've hyped them up to be? Are modern AAA FPS games not failing in the ways I described? Am I far overstating the contrast of modern AAA to the roguelike FPS? What is your favorite type of lunch sandwich? No bars held. Let me know in the comments. Sorry if I made you hungry now, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.